Someone is experiencing a deep, almost overwhelming feeling of love toward you, and the reason behind it may not be as comforting as it sounds. In fact, it has very little to do with the version of you that you consciously know. Instead, it is tied to something you unintentionally activated within them, something that lives far beneath their awareness. Once you truly understand this, it becomes difficult to ignore. Most people assume love is built on shared interests, timing, attraction, or personality alignment. That feels logical and safe, but comfort-based explanations often keep us away from deeper truths. The mind prefers safety because it avoids confronting what lies underneath. Real emotional intensity, the kind that feels uncontrollable or irrational, doesn't begin in logic. It begins in the unconscious mind, in places people rarely observe within themselves. Without realizing it, you may have stepped into an inner space inside them that had long been untouched or avoided. You didn't just make them feel good, you made them feel seen in a way that touched something sensitive, something they may not have been prepared to face. And that kind of recognition can feel both powerful and unsettling at the same time. This is where emotions begin to intensify beyond normal limits. When someone feels deeply understood, especially in areas they usually hide, they don't just form liking or attachment. They begin to develop a much stronger psychological and emotional bond. What you triggered was not surface-level affection, but something far more complex and consuming. Most people misunderstand this. They believe love is simply about connection on the surface. But what is happening here is deeper. You reflected back parts of them that were buried, unacknowledged, or suppressed. In a way, you became a mirror to things they were not consciously ready to see. This didn't happen because of anything you intentionally did. It happened because of the way you naturally exist. Something in your presence didn't fit into their usual expectations. You felt different, unpredictable, not in a chaotic way, but in a way that carried meaning they couldn't easily define. That unpredictability disrupted their internal balance. The mind is designed to rely on patterns and familiarity, and when something breaks those patterns, it creates emotional disturbance. You became that disruption, and because of it, their attention locked onto you. Over time, they stopped seeing you only as a person and started attaching meanings to you. You became symbolic in their mind, almost representing something larger than yourself. That is when projection begins. They start placing their unanswered emotional needs, hidden desires, and inner gaps onto you without realizing it. At that point, they are no longer only reacting to who you are in reality. They are reacting to what you represent inside their inner world. And that is why their attachment can feel so strong, even confusing. Letting go of you becomes difficult for them because it is not just about losing a person. It feels like losing access to something you awakened within them, and the mind resists that kind of internal confrontation. So instead they hold on, even when it becomes emotionally painful or logically unclear. But there is another layer to this that is harder to see. What you activated inside them is not only comforting or beautiful, it also includes instability, because anything that rises from the unconscious does not come out in a controlled way. Unprocessed emotions rarely emerge gently. They surface in waves, sometimes intense, sometimes confusing. They can distort perception and blur emotional boundaries. That is why their feelings toward you may seem deeply affectionate at one moment and distant the next. It is not that the emotion disappears. It is that their inner defenses activate again. A part of them feels drawn in, while another part feels the need to protect itself. This creates an internal conflict they may not fully understand. That is why their behavior can feel inconsistent. One moment they seem completely engaged, and the next they pull away. It is not a lack of feeling, but a struggle between emotional pull and internal resistance. Something inside warns them. What you're seeing in them is not just simple emotion. It's a push and pull that comes from a deeper place inside their mind. It's not physical danger they're reacting to, but something far more vulnerable for them, emotional exposure they are not fully prepared to hold. That is why their behavior keeps shifting between closeness and distance, intensity and silence, certainty and confusion. You may notice it, but you are not completely outside of it either. A part of you can also feel the weight of this connection, the emotional depth it carries, and the intensity that comes with it. That awareness is what makes everything feel so heavy and hard to ignore. Naturally, this raises an important question. How did something like this even begin? Because it didn't happen randomly. It wasn't just coincidence, attraction, or timing alone. Something shifted inside them at a very specific moment, a moment where they recognized something, even if they couldn't explain what it was. After that moment, things couldn't really go back to how they were before. But that recognition had very little to do with your external traits or surface-level qualities. It was connected to the meaning their inner world attached to you. You started representing something in their subconscious that they both desire and resist at the same time. Until that is understood, it's difficult to make sense of why the attachment feels so strong, so complicated, and emotionally charged. Because what you triggered was not just attraction. You activated something that had been silent inside them for a long time. And once something like that wakes up, it doesn't simply disappear again. It continues to grow and demand attention. At first, they likely tried to ignore it. They may have convinced themselves it was temporary, just curiosity, something that would fade with time. But instead of fading, it deepened. It became more persistent, more emotionally involved. That's because what they are experiencing isn't surface-level attraction. It comes from older emotional layers stored deep within the unconscious. And the unconscious doesn't forget in the way the conscious mind does. It holds on to emotional fragments quietly until something or someone brings them back into awareness. In this case, that role became yours. But the deeper truth is that you didn't just enter their life as another person. You became a kind of trigger, something that opened doors inside them that had been closed for years. And that is where things become complicated, because once the unconscious is activated, it doesn't wait for permission. It works silently, but with strong influence underneath everything. Most people misunderstand obsession. They expect it to look obvious, loud, or dramatic. But real obsession is often quiet. It hides behind calm behavior, controlled actions, and emotional restraint. The stronger the feeling becomes, the more the conscious mind tries to suppress it. But suppression doesn't reduce it, it intensifies it. So instead of expressing it directly, they start overthinking everything about you. Every conversation gets replayed in their mind. Every interaction is analyzed again and again in loops they can't easily break out of. Not because they choose to, but because something inside keeps pulling them back into it. In many ways, you become connected to something unresolved within them, an emotional pattern that was never fully completed. And unfinished emotional experiences are some of the most powerful forces behind human behavior. But what is important to understand is that this intensity is not only about you as a person. It is also about what you represent in their inner world. Because the mind doesn't just attach to individuals. It attaches to meanings, symbols, and emotional reflections. And in that sense, you became a symbol of something they lacked, something they longed for, or something they were never fully able to accept within themselves. That is why the connection feels deeper than logic can explain. At a certain point, this connection forces them into an inner confrontation, and that confrontation is not something they can easily walk away from. Loving you, or what you represent to them, pushes them toward parts of themselves they have avoided for a long time. This creates an internal contradiction. One part of them wants to get closer, while another part resists just as strongly. It's not because they don't feel, but because feeling so deeply exposes things they have tried to keep buried. And that inner conflict doesn't stay hidden. It shows up in their behavior, in pauses, mixed signals, emotional closeness, followed by sudden distance. And you can sense it, can't you? That inconsistency, that emotional tension that keeps shifting without explanation. What they are experiencing isn't confusion about you. It's overload inside themselves. You have touched a part of their inner world that doesn't operate on logic. It runs on emotion, memory, and desires they never fully dealt with. A part that still carries pieces of their past they believed were long gone. And now that part has been activated again. It starts raising questions they cannot easily answer. Why does this feel so familiar? Why does it affect them so deeply? Why do they feel pulled in, yet at the same time feel the urge to step away? This creates a silent split within them, not visible on the outside, but happening very strongly within. The conscious mind looks for stability and control, while the unconscious tries to resolve unfinished emotional experiences. And to resolve them, it often disrupts what feels stable. That is why they may begin to create distance, not because they want to lose you, but because they are trying to regain control over their own emotional state. They might believe that space will calm things down, that time will make the intensity fade, that stepping away will bring clarity. But in reality, emotional bonds formed at this level don't weaken just because of distance. In many cases, they become even stronger, because when physical interaction reduces, the mind fills the gap with imagination, and imagination becomes a powerful space where emotions grow without limits. In that space, you are no longer just a real person in their life. You become an image, a thought, a meaning that represents something much larger inside them. And once that happens, projections take over. They begin to attach feelings, meanings, and expectations to you that go beyond reality. These projections don't have clear boundaries, so they keep expanding. Over time, you may feel less like a person to them and more like a deeply important idea they can't easily let go of. What makes this even more complicated is that they don't fully trust what they feel. The intensity feels too fast, too deep, too powerful, and when something feels that strong, the mind assumes there must be a hidden cost. So doubt begins to appear. Fear also steps in, not to remove the feeling, but to protect them from fully surrendering to it. Because if they truly accept what they feel, they would also have to face everything it brings with it: unresolved emotions, old wounds, and parts of themselves they have avoided for a long time. And that kind of inner confrontation is not something the mind allows easily. So instead, they stay stuck in between. They want closeness but resist it. They think about you but try to stop themselves. They feel deeply but struggle to express it. This inner contradiction slowly builds pressure over time until it becomes something they can no longer keep balanced inside. And the real question is, what happens when that pressure becomes too much to hold? Because eventually something inside does shift. The human mind cannot carry unresolved emotional tension forever without it showing in some form. It may come out as honesty, withdrawal, confusion, or behavior that doesn't even make sense to them later. If you've ever felt this kind of overwhelming emotional pull, then you already understand how intense it can become when feelings move beyond logic. And here is the deeper truth. This process doesn't just disappear on its own. What has been activated inside them is not temporary, not shallow, and not something that can simply be ignored. It stays, it develops, and it continues to shape how they think, feel, and respond, whether they are ready for it or not. At some point, everything inside them starts demanding resolution. The mind always wants closure, balance, something it can settle on. But emotional experiences like this don't come without cost. The only real uncertainty is what they will be willing to let go of just to avoid fully confronting what they feel for you. Eventually, the internal resistance weakens. What they feel has already crossed the usual limits of control. You can sense it in the silence between interactions, in the emotional weight that lingers even when nothing is being said. It doesn't disappear, it stays in the background, waiting, because what is happening inside them is no longer balanced. It creates pressure, and pressure inside the mind always searches for release. At this point, it's not just curiosity or emotional interest anymore. It becomes something deeper, like an internal confrontation. They are forced in a way to face parts of themselves they have avoided for a long time. Old emotional wounds, past rejection, insecurity, and beliefs that told them they were either not enough or too much for real closeness. Then you enter that space, not by force, not by intention, but simply by presence. And in doing so, you unintentionally challenge those old inner beliefs. You bring attention to things they never fully resolved. But the mind doesn't handle contradiction easily. It resists anything that threatens its sense of stability. So instead of accepting it smoothly, it tries to reorganize reality in a way that feels safer. This is where the inner split begins. One part of them moves toward you, drawn by connection, curiosity, and the feeling of being emotionally understood in a way they may not have experienced before. That part wants closeness, depth, and emotional safety. But another part reacts very differently. It pulls away. It warns them in its own silent way that this feels too exposed, too intense, too open. Not because there is real danger outside, but because internally it feels like losing control. like being seen in ways they are not ready for, and this is where things become even heavier. The closer they feel to you, the more vulnerable they feel within themselves. That vulnerability doesn't feel soft or comforting to them, it feels like risk. Not external risk, but emotional exposure that threatens their sense of control and identity. Because you are no longer just a person they interact with. You become a trigger point inside their internal structure, something that interrupts their usual emotional defenses. A mind built on protection does not accept that easily. It tries to defend itself. It creates explanations, excuses, and alternative meanings to make the feeling seem smaller. They might tell themselves it's temporary, that it's overthinking, that it doesn't mean much. But underneath, the real effort is not understanding. It is containment, because truly accepting what they feel would mean accepting how deep it goes. And accepting how deep it goes would mean facing truths about themselves they have avoided for a long time. But containment doesn't solve it. It only delays it. The emotional pull remains steady in the background, growing quieter on the surface but stronger underneath. And over time, what is ignored doesn't disappear. It transforms. It turns into restlessness, emotional discomfort, and a subtle sense that something important is missing, even when everything looks normal externally. And slowly, your presence becomes tied to that feeling inside them. Not because you chose it, but because their inner world connected the two. You become linked to something emotionally significant that they can't easily replace or detach from. At this stage, they are no longer just reacting to you as a person in their life. They are reacting to what has been activated within them. And that internal reaction continues shaping their thoughts in quiet, persistent ways, even when they try to rationalize it or push it away. The connection doesn't fade easily, because it isn't living only in the external world anymore. It has already taken root inside their perception, where it continues to influence how they feel, think, and respond in ways they can't fully control. Everything comes down to one quiet but powerful truth. What you awakened in them is not something they can simply switch off, explain away, or return to normal. It is not a surface-level feeling that came and went with time, and it is not just ordinary attraction that fades when distance appears. What happened runs deeper than their understanding because it touched a part of their inner world that was already waiting, quiet, unfinished, and unspoken for a long time. This is why the connection never feels simple. It doesn't behave like a normal emotional experience where clarity arrives quickly and everything finds balance. Instead, it moves like waves inside them, pulling them forward and then pushing them back, making them question themselves more than they question you. One moment they feel close, drawn in, almost certain that something meaningful exists, and the next moment they feel the need to step away, to breathe, to regain control over what is happening inside their own mind. But even in the distance, nothing truly ends, because distance only removes physical presence, not internal connection. What they are really reacting to is not confusion about you, but intensity within themselves. You became the point where old emotions, unhealed memories, and silent beliefs they never fully faced began to surface again. Things they buried long ago, feelings of not being enough, fear of being seen too deeply, fear of losing control, fear of emotional exposure, all of it begins to rise in ways they cannot fully explain. And because it rises through you, their mind starts to associate you with something both deeply desired and deeply feared at the same time. That is why they cannot place you in a simple category. You are not just a passing interest, and not just another connection they can forget. You become a symbol inside their mind, something that represents emotional truth they have avoided and emotional depth they have long been disconnected from. And once a person becomes a symbol instead of just a person, the attachment changes form. It becomes heavier, more mental, more emotional, and far more difficult to release. So they try to regain balance in the only way they know how. They step back. They create distance. They tell themselves it is temporary, that it will pass, that thinking less will make things easier. But what they don't realize is that what is rooted in the unconscious doesn't weaken simply because attention is reduced. In many cases, it grows stronger in silence, because silence gives space for imagination, and imagination gives emotion more room to expand without limitation. You begin to exist in their thoughts differently, not just as someone they know, but as something they feel. A presence that continues even when you are not physically there. A meaning that keeps returning even when they try to distract themselves. And over time, this internal presence becomes harder to separate from their own emotional state. They begin to feel your absence, your memory, your meaning, not as external things, but as internal experiences that shape how they think and feel throughout the day. And the most complicated part is that they don't fully trust what they are feeling. The intensity feels too deep, too fast, too unfamiliar. So doubt enters. Fear enters, not to erase the feeling, but to protect them from fully surrendering to something they don't understand. Because full acceptance would require them to face parts of themselves they have avoided for years, old wounds, hidden insecurities, emotional truths they never fully processed. And that kind of inner confrontation is not something the mind allows without resistance. So they remain divided. One part of them moves toward connection, drawn by emotional depth, by the feeling of being seen, by something in you that reflects what they didn't know they were missing. And another part pulls away, trying to maintain control, trying to protect them from vulnerability, trying to keep their emotional world from becoming too open. This division creates the cycle you can feel: closeness followed by distance, attention followed by silence, emotional intensity followed by withdrawal. But even this cycle does not break the connection. It only proves how active it still is beneath the surface, because what is real at this level does not disappear easily. It continues to exist in the background of their thoughts, shaping reactions, influencing emotions, and creating internal tension they cannot fully resolve. And eventually, something inside always reaches its limit. The mind is not built to hold unresolved emotional tension forever. So whether through realization, emotional release, withdrawal, or unexpected expression, something eventually gives way. Not always in a predictable form, not always in a controlled way, but in a way that shows the pressure was always there. What remains in the end is this: you did not just enter their life as a person. You entered their inner world as an experience, a reflection, a trigger, and a meaning they cannot easily replace. And once something becomes part of someone's inner world at that depth, it stops being about distance, timing, or logic. It becomes something that continues to exist quietly inside them, shaping the way they feel, think, and remember, even when everything on the outside seems still.